The first slide is a stupid joke I thought of this morning at 4:30 when I was awake with jet lag, which is how many pathologists does it take to screw in a light bulb? One, if you've got a quantum physicist helping you, and that's Minas Kafatos. And the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is where he and I have collided a little bit unexpectedly, but we've been having a good time for the last couple of years. What we're really trying to, what we're trying to present, we're working on a paper that pulls it all together, is what we're calling non-dual conscious reality. See? A joke. Oh, can I see it here too? Just to make your life extra difficult?
No, it's not.
Apparently not. Yes. Yeah, okay. Now they're entangled. So we're calling it non-dual conscious reality. The reality part to sort of emphasize that material isn't reality, consciousness is reality. And that's sort of our starting axiom. And that the consciousness that reality consists of at its most fundamental level is non-dual. So that's just a name we've given it. And while it might evolve into a theory, is Minas here? Whew, yes, I can say anything I want. We're really thinking of it more as a framework for understanding things, bringing his world together with my world of knowledge, but out of it, largely through efforts he's making at the mathematization of what we're talking about, I think it will be something still more robust. And what I'm going to really be talking about is not the non-dual consciousness of which everything we say consists, but the fundamental principles that follow on the universe being organized that way. And the two main things being that the universe is fundamentally self-organizing and non-material. And sort of we're saying, what if mind comes first? What does the world look like? How do we think about the world if we posit that the mind is actually what comes first? So if the axiomatic starting point is mind is that out of which the universe arises, you know, I get yelled at a lot for this, but in fact, there's a real robust tradition from a variety of standpoints that support this as at least a viable hypothesis that needs consideration. First off, there's the whole constellation of thinking in quantum physics in one variant or another that suggests that consciousness is fundamental in some fashion. And there are various flavors to that amongst all these people, but there is something essential there from a quantum physics point of view. And it's really interesting to me talking to physicists who sort of, when you get to that aspect of what the founding fathers of quantum physics said, they just sort of hand wave and go, well, they were confused about it. Well, it's confusing, but these people were awfully smart and were willing to at least suggest the hypothesis that this was one way of interpreting the world. And then there's the Western philosophical tradition, and it would be hard to argue that in some measure, in some fashion, though there are obviously profound differences amongst them, Plato, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, and particularly Whitehead, who was formulating his ideas as a way of incorporating quantum physics findings into Western philosophy, all held this as a possibility at least, if not in fact their preferred possibility. And then you can turn to contemplative traditions of all sorts and find that throughout diverse traditions, east, west, north, south, at the heart of many of them, you find this description that fundamentally what underlies everything is non-dual conscious awareness, the awareness of awareness. So it's not as though we're coming out as kind of quirky, crazy guys in the 21st century. We are actually embedded within a tradition that says this is a viable hypothesis. And we're trying to explore, if you accept that, and stir it together with what we know about contemporary science, what sort of picture of the universe do you get? What's the framework for understanding how the universe is organized? Now, for the quantum physics side of this is where Minas obviously started. For me, it's really starting as a pathologist, as a physician scientist, and I started as some of you might have heard this morning, in the stem cell world, and I still do stem cell research. For me, the entry point to begin considering larger questions beyond just liver stem cells or stem cells in adult humans was how you can conceive of the body as made of cells that form a complex self-organizing system that's adaptive. And that opened up the world of complexity theory and self-organizing systems to me. And so to get us all on the same page, I'm going to give you a brief little intro to that. These two books, while already more than 10 years old, still are really beautiful discussions of some of the fascinating aspects of complex systems and the emergent self-organizing phenomena that arise from them, one by Richard Lewin and the other by Stephen Johnson. So we talk about complex systems or complex adaptive systems. The fact that they're adaptive is a key point of what we're considering. And these are basically defined as systems of interacting individuals that, if they fulfill 4 criteria, organize themselves from the bottom up into larger scale structures. And those structures often appear planned from the top downward, but they're not. And these structures are often referred to as emergence or emergent self-organization. And as I said, a key aspect of them is that they are adaptive. So that as an environment changes around a living complex system, it can change the way it self-organizes to adapt to that changing environment. It's been applied to all sorts of things. This is really the dominant way we think of economic markets now. If you're familiar with Jane Jacobs, before we had the terminology of complexity theory, everything she was talking about how cities self-organize, this was complexity theory. Immune systems in terms of cell biology was the first place that was applied there. My favorite is Beatlemania because, I mean, if you think the Beatles were one of the greatest rock bands who ever lived, and you think they were responsible for Beatlemania. If you listen to them talking about Beatlemania, they're very clear that it was all driven by the Screaming Girls. It was their fan base that drove their creativity, and they were simply responding to that. They think of it as a bottom-up phenomenon, not a top-down phenomenon. So what are these 4 criteria? 1, numbers matter. 3 ants don't organize into a colony. It takes about 12 ants before you see self-organization. If you have 100 ants, that will not be as complex as 1,000 ants, which will not be as complex as 100,000 ants. So a village is not a city, it's not a megalopolis, but they are all aspects of a complex system. There has to be a predominance of negative feedback loops, so there's homeostasis. There can be positive feedback loops, but they can't predominate. If they do predominate, you can still get self-organization, but instead of being adaptive, then they're self-limiting, energy expending. So think tornadoes, hurricanes, cancer on a cellular level. So you need homeostasis within the system. Interactions are local without global sensing. No ant in the colony is paying attention to whether there's enough food in the colony. They're just paying attention to what's going on in their locale. And this is the key thing, that there needs to be some low-level randomness in the system. If there's too much randomness, you get no self-organization. You just get total disorder. If you don't have any randomness in the system, then when the environment changes, you're still going to get the same precise self-organization you had before, like an air conditioner turning on or off. It's a machine, it's not a living thing. The low-level randomness, or what's often referred to in complexity terms as quench disorder, is just enough randomness to allow flexibility so that self-organization can change in an adaptive way if the environment changes. So an ant food line looks like a straight line, but if you bend down and look more closely, there's always a few ants that aren't following the line. And it turns out that if you put your foot down in the line, it's these ants that will very rapidly establish an efficient, speedy way around your foot. Or if the food runs out, it's these ants not in the line who will find another food source. And it's not that there's anything special about these ants, they just didn't happen to pick up the pheromone trails. They're the same as any other ant. So it's not like there are some people who are special as the divergent creative part of the community. Everyone, given the right circumstance, every ant has that potential to be vital for the system as a whole. And we applied this to cell biology and realized that cells actually are doing the same thing. Cells fulfill all those criteria, and we can start to think of bodies as simply self-organizing communities of cells from embryologic through fetal life, postnatal development, adulthood, etc. I'm not going to go into the math of it, but one inherent aspect of the math of this is mass extinction events. You can't get away from it. What the quench disorder that allows for adaptive self-organization also implies that at some point, given enough time, there will be a mass extinction event in the system. And this may be a way of describing some diseases within a body or what happens on community levels. Another way to think about this is that the price of adaptation, of being a living biological system, means you absolutely have to die. There's no such thing as eternal life, a fountain of youth, etc. It's necessarily inherent in circumstances. All of this implies already something very special. and I touched on this briefly this morning. From a distance, an ant colony can look like a solid thing, but you go up close and you see it's not a solid thing at all. It's just a phenomenon arising from smaller things, the ants. And since I've already said ant bodies, like our bodies, are self-organizing systems of cells, if you go to the microscopic level, you see that the ant itself disappears and is just a colony or a flock of organizing cells. So whether something is a thing or a phenomenon depends on the scale of observation you're viewing it at. There is no such thing as inherent thingness at these levels of scale, at least. And here's a film that's not going to work of a flock of birds I was going to show you, but we're on a different computer now. So. And when I was talking to Manas and we first started communicating, this was actually the meeting point of his world and my world. The idea that this is actually a form of complementarity, like the complementarity you see in quantum physics. And we started using the phrase quantum-like, which we'll touch on a little bit more. And what we mean is, at this level of scale, it's something like this classical figure. Is this two faces or is it a vase? It's both. Now, this isn't a quantum diagram, so it's not exactly the same complementarity as wave-particle duality. But at this level of scale, this is a form of duality. Neither two faces nor a vase fully describe this image, nor can you see both of those at the same time. You can move very quickly between them, but you cannot see the faces and the vase simultaneously. So this is a form of complementarity. So if we come back to this idea of hierarchies, we can diagram it in slightly different ways. Cells self-organize into bodies, which self-organize into communities. Depending on what you classify as a body, you get different kinds of communities, whether they're cities, cultures, ecosystems. The Gaia hypothesis, Lovelock was also here talking about something, the world as a self-sustaining, adaptive, complex system. Now I'm in trouble. Like Jane Jacobs, intuiting the principles of complex systems before he had the terminology. So are cells an actual thing, that they exist and have, and there's nothing that self-organizes into them? This could be an hour talk. I'm not going to go into the details, but no, cells are not a thing. If you go down to the nanoscopic level, they are biomolecules and smaller molecules, and in some cases atoms and ions, that are self-organizing in aqueous solution at body temperature, which supplies just the right amount of disorder to allow self-organization into cells. It's why body temperature is so important. It's why water is so important. And then we're in a realm that Peter Cariani, a very important complexity theorist, talked about thermodynamic complexity. It's like complex systems at this level of scale, but somewhat different. There are overlapping principles. But in that case, you can start to think as biomolecules as nothing but self-organizing atoms. Atoms are nothing but self-organizing subatomic particles. And so have we gotten down to subatomic particles are a fundamental thing that aren't arising from something smaller self-organizing? And maybe that would be strings. Is there anything smaller? Well, in general, there's agreement amongst physicists, while they won't exactly agree on what quantum foam and quantum vacuum is. There is a smallest level, and there is nothing smaller. And the things that are arising, whether they're strings or particles or some other kind of entity, are sort of popping in and out of the vacuum. And most of those will self-annihilate, but the ones that don't can interact with each other and start to self-organize into these larger scale structures. So in fact, there's nothing throughout the self-organizing universe visualized this way that has inherent existence. And if that's starting to sound familiar to you, I'll make it a little more explicit shortly. So if the universe is a self-organizing system in which no element has inherent existence, then one thing that starts to fall out of it is there are all these parallels with quantum physics, and again, what Manas and I have been talking about as quantum-like phenomena. In terms of complementarity, we talked a little bit of, I'll speed through this. No, he'll want me to say this. So in terms of complementarity, quantum phenomena exhibit complementary aspects that are revealed by specific observations, i.e. there are a range of possible states prior to observation, and any single observation is unable to capture all aspects of the complete physical situation simultaneously. And what we're saying is that biological complementarity, in fact, you can extend this to the cosmological level, is an analogous sort of thing. And it's interesting, if you're familiar with Max Delbruck, who won the Nobel Prize at Cold Spring Harbor for viruses, the reason he went to Cold Spring Harbor is Bohr said, there's a biological complementarity and I want you to find him. He was a disciple of Bohr. And Bohr thought the edge of life was the likeliest place to find it, so he started studying viruses. He never found biological complementarity, but he won a Nobel Prize. So that's pretty good. And this quantum-like thing, Menas has referred to as horizons of knowledge. In this case, as you move from one level of scale to another, you lose the view you had before and lose the information that's specific to that level of scale, but now you're going to encounter information and structures that you couldn't observe before as you pass over that horizon to a different level of scale. Is that fair? Okay, thumbs up, yes. That also means that at every level of scale, which exists simultaneously, we are not any single level of scale. We are every level of scale all at once. But you can only consider one perspective at any given time. So if you look at this level of scale, my finger is bounded by its skin. If you go down a level of scale, well, you have to include what are they called? Eulogize. Bacteria. It can be a really simple word. And you know, it's very specific. It's not just that we carry bacteria, but there are specific bacteria without which we can't live. Within a few days, you'd be dead, because the bacteria that line your creases of your joints, everyone will have different kinds of bacteria and combinations, but what's characteristic is they survive on digesting and eating the membranes of dying skin cells and create lanolin, which lubricates your joints, so you have an effective barrier against the outside world. And in the same way, the bacteria that line your digestive tract, if you don't have bacteria, you don't have a normal histologic structure of the cells lining your GI tract, and you can't absorb food. Your genome doesn't code for the structure of the cells lining your GI tract. It codes for the interaction with the bacteria out of which arises the absorptive surface of your bowel. So a human body doesn't exist without the 100-fold times more bacteria. So this cloud of bacteria, this idea that at this level of scale, the boundary of your body is actually considerably wider, is real. It's not a metaphor. And then if you go down further in scale, you're at the atomic level, and you know, we're breathing, the plants are breathing what we breathe what they breathe, blah, 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 pheromones, you know, et cetera. And as I said this morning, when you think about it, every single atom in your body is something you ate, drank, or breathed, with a few exceptions that you got from your mother, which is interesting biology, and you can ask me about that after. But other than that, and that means we aren't creatures living on the planet. We are the planet that has self-organized into things that think of themselves as creatures. And so we have to start thinking about holism, not reductionism. So thus, even at levels of scale governed by classical physics, observational choice, which level of scale and which level of therapeutic intervention also, for example, remains inextricably woven into the establishment in the observational moment of the present conditions of existence. In our view, the hierarchy of horizons of knowledge requires the interplay of the observer with the observed in a fundamental way, and as such, biological reality, as much as quantum reality, is neither immutable nor external. In views of thinkers such as von Neumann, Wigner, and Stapp, is Henry in here? Oh, he didn't come back, good. These concepts implicate consciousness itself as inextricably linked to the moment-by-moment evolution of the living universe. So we published that in a complexity journal, the leading complexity journal. Interestingly, it was very easy to get published in a complexity journal. They barely critiqued this. We tried it in consciousness journals and in physics. No one wanted to touch it. Complexity, they were like, yeah, it's kind of obvious, but your pictures are pretty. So the quantum-like stuff we're talking about, I'll just dance through it. In the quantum realm, we have superposition of wave-particle features. In the biological realm, we have superposition of scale-dependent characteristics. In the quantum realm, we have description by a wave function that comprises stochastic potentials that collapse into observed phenomena only with the act of observation. In the biological realm, we have description as a nonlinear dynamical system that comprises stochastic potentials of observable emergent phenomena that only can be demonstrated by running the system. You can't make predictions because of the quench disorder. The measurement problem, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. In biology, what we have is mathematically complex systems lie at the fractal boundary between order and chaos. And because this is a fractal, it's exquisitely sensitive to any possible selection you might make of where you're going to look in the system, where you touch it, how you move it. So there is no living system that isn't exquisitely sensitive and unpredictable on that basis. So the measurement problem becomes one of boundary and scale selection, just like we were talking about before. And very much specifically, like Chris was talking about earlier, where you decide to make your boundary. I have an entomologist studying an ant colony, and the entomologist is sitting here, and the ant colony is there, and the entomologist draws the boundary here, and that's a perfect way to study ants. But if you're the ecologist studying the ecosystem, standing on a hill looking at the entomologist who's traipsed into your environment, and the fox didn't walk by the ant colony, and they trod on the plants that the ant colony might have been eating, and they stepped in the other ant colony that was actually going to take over this ant colony, well, you've disrupted the system. Neither view is the entire thing, and neither view is wrong, but neither view takes the whole picture. So again, it's quantum-like. And in this case, it's about boundary selection. And another implication is that we don't live in the universe anymore, we live on the planet. We are the universe that has self-organized into these beings that think we're important. And in Buddhist terms, this would be the difference between the relative and the absolute. And so speaking of Buddhisms, this stuff all maps, interestingly, to a lot of Buddhist metaphysics. That thingness is dependent on scale is what is meant by emptiness of inherent existence. Inevitable mass extinction events is what's meant by impermanence. That the system depends on every single member, and any member and how it behaves can result in major changes in how it self-organizes. That's interdependence. And the fact that emergence is predictable, if all these features are in play, there will be emergence. You just can't predict exactly what it is. That's karmic law. Hindu and Jewish mysticism, if you diagram the world as we did, as arising from some sort of energetic vacuum, generative vacuum, into whatever the lowest level things are, quantum foam down here, into all this stuff which we understand very well, this is actually very similar to what's talking in Hindu metaphysics with Brahman giving rise to Ishvara. They are not two, they are in complementarity to each other, but you cannot experience them both simultaneously. And in Jewish mysticism, it's precisely the same thing. And in fact, the Hebrew terms in Jewish mysticism actually follow very nicely what sort of processes we're talking about over here. So these structures and processes therefore solve the paradox in these mystical systems of how what links us to the divine is simultaneously what obscures that link. You can't see it while you're in it. And then finally we come back to the implied fundamental principles that arise from thinking about things of the universe in a self-organizing fashion in this way. Again, what happens here at the vacuum foam level, we can argue about precisely what's going on. It depends on whether you're partial to multidimensional strings or quantum gravity but something is emerging, emanating at that ground state, and it's in complementarity with what it's coming from. And those things, and this comes back to what Chris was talking about again, interactivity is what allows these things to interact. You don't get self-organization if things can't interact with each other. There's got to be interaction, which one can think of as exchange of information. And when you have that, you get creative interactivity. It's creative because it's going to give rise to higher level structures. And those higher level structures then begin to behave like things, which then self-organize into higher level things. And it keeps going on, up, up, up. And this is the third thing. The fact that it keeps going upwards in levels of scale is the third thing that falls out of this, is this recursion through all systems. And that's reflected in part through the fractal mathematics that describe complex self-organizing systems. And then what we're saying is it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, to suggest, the hypothesis that all of this is in fact arising from the non-dual conscious awareness. There's nothing scientifically that opposes this idea, and in fact this idea has a robust history. Contemplative traditions of all cultures, certainly Western philosophy, and quantum physics, which everyone is happy to say is the most precise, successful theory we've ever had. And the founders of that theory said, you know, this is possible. So it needs at least to be considered, and considered carefully. Another way to diagram this, oh, we're going to finish early. I didn't think I'd manage that, is to diagram it something like this. Quantum foam, quantum vacuum, whatever, in complementarity to each other, self-organizing through creative interactivity, upwards in scale, all the way around. And as we know, mathematically in some systems, the largest comes right back around to the smallest. Notice that non-locality is what predominates at this level of scale. And the only place you start to get materiality, things that actually seem to have existence, if you don't look too closely, is around the level of atoms starting to stick together into molecules. It's in this zone that you start, the material world starts to emerge as material. But the fact is, the fundamental nature of the universe is not material. And the communication here is non-local at the lowest levels. But when you go to the higher levels, particularly in biological systems, then you start getting communication that requires communication between things. In the quantum realm, if things are non-local, then sort of everything is within as much as interacting with other things. And so entanglement and non-locality become very important at the lowest levels of scale. But the minute you start to get higher levels of scale, what you start to get is signaling the interactions are born by things from the lower scales down. And so in terms of hadrons and quarks, these are self-organizing into higher level structures, into atoms, into molecules. And when you get into biological systems, nervous system, cells, molecules, ions, every more complex creature is using every aspect of the levels of complexity below that as signaling, as mediators of the signaling that allow for interaction. And so initially we were talking about this in terms of sentience because we started with biology. We backpedaled from that and more recently talking about creative interactivity, and I think this again reflected a bit of what Chris was talking about earlier. Creative interactivity is what allows the world to self-organize. That's how things happen. But in biological systems, when things start to have more definitive boundaries, then you start to get what we might call sentience. And I'm talking about this in terms that Maturana and Varela would have used, which I don't have time to go into. But that's in our paper on sentience. And so this diagram then gets modified. There's a biological pathway here, and these green arrows, instead of calling it creative interactivity, we would actually call it sentience. This is how the smallest bounded biological structures, some biomolecules like DNA and all cells, interact with each other. It's through sentient processes. And so this relates to how consciousness, in some fashion, one aspect of how it's transduced in biological systems. So our draft manuscript of this paper finishes with this. We propose a model, a framework of consciousness that, while preeminent in philosophical traditions, has not yet been formalized in contemporary scientific terms. Non-dual conscious realism posits the universe arising from an undifferentiated, non-dual field of pure conscious awareness. From within this field emanate the phenomena of Planck scale, quantum vacuum, and quantum foam, generating space, time, matter, and energy. So everything is within consciousness. Through successive complementary, recursive, creative interactions, phenomena at all scales self-organize into the emergent phenomena at each next higher scale, comprising the entire cosmos. This panpsychist perspective is consistent with all known scientific phenomena and is inclusive of the inextricable linkage between observer and observed decisively revealed by quantum mechanics, but goes beyond the usual panpsychist views. Corollaries include that materiality is scale-dependent, and I would say boundedness is also scale-dependent, where boundaries are located. They're not implicit in existence. The hard problem is assumed by all phenomena being qualia within consciousness. There isn't anything that isn't qualia. And neural correlates of consciousness in this model would be seen as transducing rather than creating consciousness for adaptive species-specific perceptions and behaviors. Why our brains are different than, a hummingbird's. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Few questions here?
Thanks, Neil. That was really interesting. My question is, you've talked a lot about scale. Do you view scale as an objective feature of the world, or do you view scale as a measurement outcome?
That's a really good question. It's sort of like when Manas earlier said, talking about temporality, something coming prior to that. And it's like, oh, wait. I think it's a problem with language, in part. I think it's suggested by this mathematical note that the smallest is equivalent to the largest in some fashions, but it's also related to the fractal nature of things, and that's scale independent. So when I say that things are scale dependent, I'm saying that me as a human being, using the devices I have available to me, either just my eyes or a microscope or a telescope or whatever, are selecting which tools to use to observe something. But in terms of how the universe is as an entity, I don't think there's time or space, and those are just how it's being observed, measured. Yeah. So it's a problem, it's a personal problem, but I think it's a general problem. How do we separate our understanding and experience of a universe with our metaphors for describing it? But no, I think you're right. I don't think scale itself, scale is scale dependent. How's that?
Thank you.
Okay.
I was looking at your 4 characteristics for self-adaptive systems. I think it was a third one, that the interactions have to be global without, they have to be local without global sensing.
Yeah.
So we are self-adaptive as well, humans.
Yes.
But we have, from spiritual practices, so to speak, we have global sensing. So how does that play into your description?
I would like to meet the person who thinks he has global sensing and actually does. I mean, there are plenty of people in our economic and political systems that believe they have global sensing, but they don't. While I think that through spiritual practice one can hope to attain that, I'm not sure it's a practical question.
Well, maybe I'm not understanding the term global sensing, but what I interpret as, for example, a state of samadhi, a state of being aware of distant things that normally you're not aware of. From that point of view, if I'm, for example, going to a deep state of meditation, and I can feel the life around me, and I can feel the influence of the life that the life has around me, independent of the usual material interactions, then how is that not global sensing?
It is wider sensing, but it's not global. 3 months ago, when you were sitting in a state of samadhi, were you aware there was an Ebola epidemic brewing in Africa that was going to be causing such a havoc? I don't have any doubt that you had a much wider sense available to you, but truly global, monitoring every aspect of the system, I don't think that does exist. And if you do, then what you wind up doing is, this is why top-down systems often fail. They can work for a time, but there's always going to be stuff that wasn't noticed that leads to the collapse. And so it's an illusion of global sensing, but usually there's something left out. Now, from the point of view of the non-dual consciousness, is that the only level at which, in fact, there is true global sensing? This is actually, I think, part of the discussion Manas and I have ongoing with Deepak Chopra, where he would like to say that, yes, that's true global sensing. I don't know what you would say, Manas. And he doesn't either. Yeah. Because we're in the land of the non-dual. So having a wide view doesn't mean global sensing. It just means having a wider view.
We have time for a very quick, short question.
That means I have to have quick, short answers too. I don't know that I can do that.
In classical nonlinear dynamics, you have dissipation, and so you can have attractors and see self-organization that way. Whereas in quantum systems, the dynamics is conservative. I've seen some attempts to talk about self-organization in terms of quantum chaos playing the role of dissipation, but how do you get across the boundary? And then a further interesting issue is that in quantum biology lately, it appears that dissipation can pump entangled states, can maintain coherence at room temperature. And so all of this is another feedback level at play.
Yeah, and we keep coming up against this. We don't know how to solve this question. The way I gloss over it is Peter Cariani's stuff about thermodynamic complexity, which is like complexity, kind of like we're using quantum like. A plasma has features that are arising as an emergent phenomenon. It's not happening mathematically in the same way. This is a puzzle we don't know how to deal with.
Thank you. Give Neil a warm hand.
Thank you.